Welcome to part one on my series of power and analyses of what power is and how it can be understood via various prisms, but also understood through the vicarious mindset of certain men throughout history. I'm fairly fascinated with power as a concept and as an extrinsic motivator. It is you could say, Gothic double almost for our will to power, but in that sense that there's only two strong extrinsic motivators, and that is power and treasure, booty, and our soul is almost enraptured with the thought of possessing either or, some combination, hybridization of both, but in some realm of, or in a spectrum, we are targeting towards this infinite amount of X. And in this video, or in this series even, I'll analyze power conceptually like that. So the first video I thought was apropos to this subject via Carl von Clausewitz. He was a German general and militarist thinker. He wrote a book called Vom Kriege, just on war, and in that he detailed a lot of nuances around the reasons for war, how to coordinate wars and battles, the difference between strategies and tactics, what's important, what you should think about when you are waging war in a very holistic sense. And so he wrote what was in the Prussian geometric style, so very A having a, as I say before, opposite B, and this very much you could call it a bijective mapping of certain factors to each other. So when we understand war, we, as he points out, think of it as an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. We want, and this is a political aim, that enemy, as the Carl Schmitt friend-enemy distinction, but we want that enemy to do as we say, and we have political motives for this. We want them to either be subsumed by us culturally or civilization-wise. So if you're building an empire, for instance, then you would want power over that populace for that reason. If you're waging a war for territory or for resources, plunder, pillaging, spoilage, things like that, then that would also have different connotations around the purpose of war. But what I'm interested in is obviously here around how war is an instrument of power, and that the power aspect of war relates directly to the participants in a war, their political aims and objectives, and then how war is a test and kind of the show of power, but of the force that can be rendered unto them. The compunction part of war is absent, so we're not certainly morally objecting to war on principle. If you are, that is to say, someone who's interested in power, then there will be a natural instinct to fight, and that, as I say in a previous video, is a fight against yourself, your own will. It's mano a mano, or it's in a collective unity, a pitched battle or sequential battles in a war. So the idea that we are purposefully seeking out and entertaining conflict as a means to an end, and the end being more power, and that this is the logical conclusion to conflict and tension being a mechanism by which the higher the tension, the heightened result and power that is garnered after victory. So we can relate a lot of these concepts to Clausewitz and how he's demonstrated and understood them in the context of war specifically, and that's why power, I can understand it to be of primacy in the realm of who wages which wars, more or less. We want to understand first then that power relates to a political goal, so that we have to, by demonstration of our force and might, try to beat an enemy and obtain our goal. You can't wage war without a goal. So the idea that you're just in some self-defensive situation is still the goal of throwing off your antagonist and the attacker, which is to say, if you personally are seeking power, you will have to understand that there will be a war to be waged, and you have to pick your goals and determining exactly why you need to be waging them and when and how. But I think more or less, once we understand the why for war in the way that I've said, the conceptual sense, then we can understand the what, the when, the where, the how, and then in that sense can definitely tie into an ambit what our force and our might is hopefully deployed in the right ways to achieve for us. But it is down to these goals. So in your mindset, if you are saying, yes, I want to be a powerful person, set the goals and then design your battles and your wars to allow you to accomplish those things. If you first have to work on yourself and go to war with your own will and understand that you're not perfect and that the only way for you to be able to accomplish your goals is to better yourself, then that's the war you'll have to fight first. This is not some general self-help, but it's just a baseline fundamental catechism you'll have to abide by. The idea that Clausewitz understands war is through this mechanism of political aim. So he understands that it is a subsection or a subset of war, politics in general. So I won't drown you with many of his quotes here, but he does start by saying that the thesis then must be repeated. War is an act of force, and there is no logical limit to the application of that force. Each side, therefore, compels its opponent to follow suit. A reciprocal action is started, which must lead, in theory, to extremes. This is the first case of interaction and the first extreme we meet with. And so the application of force should be how you understand yourself and your own will. How much force can you bring to bear? And this, for us, is our personal intellectual force, but it can also be our physical and bodily force, and also some spiritual and magical force, and whether we can adapt ourselves to handle this in a way that we only have to achieve victory. We don't necessarily have to transcend reality here, but you need to be able to be capable of winning the war. And to do that, you have to understand how you're deploying your own force and your own will in that way. It's super important to understand that the power here, and the power aspect being the control of a certain people or objective, and that you and your will are the predetermined, you're the sovereign, more or less, of that decision. And so that's how we can fundamentally understand our lust for power, but also how power operates as a mechanism. The next quote I wanted to take out was one around how we can define victory, because it's important once you've gone to battle and war that you actually understand if you're being victorious and what that means, and that we can look at the conception of victory as a whole. And in it he describes three elements: the greater loss of enemy in physical power, the moral power, and the open avowal by this relinquishment in his intentions. So to say that we might be comfortable with the assurances an enemy gives us after his acknowledged defeat, which is to say an enemy can become an ally, and then an ally can further increase your own power. So the more coordination, cooperation, the more collectivity around so willpower in this sense of collective willpower can drive us to further and further heights. And this is how we understand movements, and why in war more troops is not necessarily but nominally a better thing. And we can understand that more strongly. Well, how he's described is the best strategy is to be very strong, first generally, and then at a decisive point. So strength, as I say, it needs to be understood. You need to reflect on who you are and how strong you are, and then in your allies what their strengths are, and how you can seek to train or to embellish or to grow those things, because more strength is always better. And this is how you can come into more and more power, is to grow your own strength and your team or your allies' own strength, and therefore you will thus grow exponentially larger and be capable of dealing more force against an enemy with a specific goal in mind around the victory. He has a lot of I would say, philosophical points almost when it comes to war in general. So it is worth reading Vom Krieger if you have the chance. And I would say, if you're more interested in what a Western pre-Caesar Sun Tzu sounds like, Sun Tzu being the Chinese equivalent of strategies in war and battle, but to say the timeline for Sun Tzu was post the Caesar era for the Chinese dynasties, whereas von Clausewitz, he has come in the Napoleonic era, so he has a different mindset around battles. He hasn't got as much context around how new battles are fought with regards to the technologies, but also the style of combatants, so guerrilla tactics, partisans, all these sort of new-ish methods of fighting war don't necessarily relate to his strategies on war specifically. But I think when we take war as a concept in general and how it relates to power, he's certainly got a very good understanding of the domain from political aims and goals all the way through to the actual how do we fight this battle to win the war, to win the aims. He does advocate audacity over timidity. There are a lot of powerful and profound, you could call them methods, but the understandings of what it takes to win, and that it is more important to be decisive, it is more important to focus on your enemy's weaknesses and understand your own capabilities, and he calls it converting knowledge into action here, but that you cannot have knowledge without the capabilities associated to it. We can, I guess lastly then, think of war as just the techniques by which we achieve power, but to understand power as the ability to also wage war. It is this synchronistic, almost symbiotic relationship between having power and being able to wage war. So having the might and having the sovereignty, you might call it, in that sense, where the hierarchical transition, so if you're seeking to go up the hierarchy with either you and your allies against enemies, this will naturally occur in any hierarchical order that is thrown into chaos. You can then understand war as this sorter by which you can now order the new I don't want to say Novus Ordo Seclorum, but the new world order in that way. But it really is this Canis Edit. It's the dog eat dog of, do you want to be more powerful, and are you stronger than the dog in front of you? We can potentially have the denouement here just around the fact that von Clausewitz was such a strong appreciator of war because of its effects, but also because it can necessarily allow for peace. We don't necessarily think as peace is the same thing as what previously peace meant, in terms of an arms race now is related much more to nuclear peace than it is a strong standing army peace, where the reality of a conflict was almost always or omnipresent, whereas now we obviously have much higher deterrent around peace, and that it's a nuclear technology on the grand scale does not allow for these huge, very dynamic and chaotic wars anymore. That all more modern wars will be fought a little bit like skirmishes and technology online and those sort of things. But I think in general the idea should be for you, if I'm interested in power and how war enables the attainment of power, how can I be the war master? What exactly is it about me and how I understand myself that can allow me to progress up that hierarchical ladder and transcend what would be the natural order?